Karl Marx never softened his words when describing capitalism. He revealed, with numbers and historical evidence, that every gold coin stacked in European vaults was soaked in Latin American blood. When Spanish and Portuguese conquerors first set foot in the Americas, they did not bring civilization, as they liked to claim. They brought chains, whips, and extraction. What they established was nothing less than the world's first globalized system of mass exploitation. Marx gave it a name, primitive accumulation, the violent process that turned entire colonies into human gold mines. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, millions of indigenous lives were lost in the ingenios and mines of Latin America. The silver ripped out of Potosí didn't enrich local communities. Instead, it sailed across the Atlantic to line the vaults of English and Dutch banks. That is where capitalism took its first breath, not from innovation or progress, but from crime. It wasn't a tragic accident of history. It was a project. In Capital, Marx demonstrated that Europe's industrial wealth was built on three bloody foundations. 1. The slavery of plantations, producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton. 2. The plunder of precious metals, ripped from the Americas. 3. The extermination of indigenous populations, clearing the land for profit. While Manchester and London filled with smoke from new factories in the 19th century, Mexico and Peru remained trapped in monoculture economies. These nations were forced to sell cotton, coffee, and rubber at humiliatingly low prices. Meanwhile, Britain bought raw materials for pennies and resold textiles at outrageous rates, manufacturing not just goods, but a cycle of dependency that still persists today. And what happened when a nation dared to break these chains? History answers clearly: capitalism retaliated with violence. Take the case of Haiti. After the Haitian Revolution of 1804, the first successful slave revolt in history, the new nation abolished slavery and stood defiant before Europe. But France struck back, demanding reparations for lost property. The price? The equivalent of $21 billion today. Haiti carried that burden for over a century, finally finishing repayment in 1947. The result was devastating: the richest colony in the Caribbean became its poorest nation. Not by chance, but by design. This was the script of savage capitalism: first plunder the land, then suffocate the survivors with debt. But the violence did not end with colonialism. Karl Marx warned that capitalism would reinvent itself, and he was right. In the 20th century, corporations like the United Fruit Company turned Central America into what came to be called banana republics, where local dictators served foreign interests rather than their own people. When Guatemala's Jacobo Arbenz attempted land reform in 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup in the name of freedom. But it wasn't freedom for the poor, it was freedom to exploit. Marx had already written it clearly: capital comes into the world dripping with blood from every pore. And history has done nothing but confirm his words. From illegal mining in the Amazon, to starvation wages in Mexican maquiladoras, to Argentina's suffocating external debt, the same machinery grinds on, only dressed in new clothes. Marx was not a prophet, he was a scientist. His analysis remains one of the clearest explanations for why, even after centuries, Latin America continues to bleed. If there is one law written in fire and iron across Latin America's economic history, it is this: capitalism never allowed the region to compete on equal terms. Marx demonstrated that international trade is not a fair game, it is domination disguised as free markets. While Europe and the United States industrialized by exporting goods with added value, Latin America was trapped in the role of raw material supplier: coffee, sugar, copper, oil, always sold at humiliating prices. This was not a choice. It was an imposition. In the 19th century, while England flooded the world with textiles and machines, countries like Brazil and Colombia were maintained as giant open-air plantations. Marx dissected this perverse mechanism: the real value of Latin American labor was never paid. An English worker in the 19th century, exploited though he was, still received wages that allowed for precarious survival. Meanwhile, workers in Brazilian coffee estates or Bolivian silver mines were treated as disposable tools. This brutal difference was not accidental, it was structural. Capitalism required zones of superexploitation to maintain its profits. And every time a nation tried to break this logic, the system struck back with iron fists. When Mexico nationalized its oil in the early 20th century, the response was an international boycott. In the 1950s, when Guatemala tried to redistribute idle United Fruit Company land to peasants, a US-backed coup crushed the attempt. Marx had already explained it, the bourgeois state is nothing more than a committee to manage the common affairs of the capitalist class. And their business required that Latin America remain poor. Latin American industry, whenever it tried to emerge, was sabotaged. Countries that attempted import substitution policies, like Argentina and Chile between the 1930s and 1950s, were met with diplomatic pressure, embargoes, and even military interventions. The result was distorted economies, unable to produce their own technology and condemned to import even what they could have manufactured themselves. Dependence. That is the key word. Dependence on foreign machines. Dependence on international loans. Dependence on foreign corporations that repatriated profits while leaving misery behind. And the game continues. Only the rules are more sophisticated. Free trade agreements benefit multinational corporations, not workers. External debt remains a weapon used to enforce privatizations and social cuts. And when a government like Venezuela's tries to use its oil wealth to fund popular programs, the response comes in the form of sanctions and destabilization. Marx warned us, and history proved him right, capitalism doesn't tolerate independence. Its survival depends on keeping regions like Latin America locked into dependency. And each time the chains rattle, the system pulls them tighter. Marx understood something fundamental: capitalism does not tolerate sovereignty on the periphery. And nowhere is that clearer than in Latin America. There's a cruel irony at the heart of this story. While Latin American nations are pressured to open their markets, wealthy countries quietly subsidize their own industries and agriculture. U.S. cotton farmers, for example, receive billions in subsidies, while small producers in Brazil or Paraguay are crushed by unfair competition. This isn't free trade. This is economic imperialism, exactly as Marx described it. So the question becomes, how long can this story repeat itself? Latin America has already been plundered by colonialism, strangled by unequal trade, and sabotaged by imperialist interventions. And yet, as Marx also taught, wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. Think of the Brazilian farm worker harvesting coffee under a blazing 40-degree sun. The Mexican laborer sewing shirts for 12-hour shifts inside maquiladoras. The Bolivian miner descending hundreds of meters into the earth to extract tin. Different faces, different countries, but the same destiny. They produce wealth they will never enjoy. Marx had a word for this theft: surplus value, the brutal difference between the wealth created by workers and the starvation wages they actually receive. In Latin America, exploitation doesn't follow an old script. It's rewritten daily, often with even more cruelty than in Marx's time. In Victorian England, a textile worker might labor 14 hours a day. Today, in factories in Guatemala or Honduras, 16-hour shifts are common. But here's the cruel twist: in 19th-century Europe, there was at least a growing labor movement pushing back. In much of Latin America today, unions are crushed with hired guns, blacklists, and state repression. Marx predicted this. Capitalism will always seek the cheapest source of labor, and Latin America became its perfect laboratory. Look at the maquiladoras along the US-Mexico border. Women assemble high-tech televisions they will never afford. They earn $6 a day producing items that sell for $600. Where's the profit? In relative surplus value, technological productivity that enriches the boss, not the worker. And in Central America's sugarcane fields, workers still collapse from heatstroke before the age of 30. That is absolute surplus value, profit squeezed from more hours and more sweat, until the body simply gives out. Or take the Bolivian miners of the 21st century. They descend 400 meters into shafts that look more like tombs, breathing dust that kills them by age 40. All so that silver can be turned into European jewelry. Marx once wrote that labor consumes the worker himself. He was describing exactly this. Here lies the obscenity: while a Bolivian miner earns $30 a day risking his life, the CEO of a European mining company earns the same amount in 30 seconds. But modern exploitation has found even more cynical methods. Digital delivery platforms have turned Latin American couriers into proletarians of the algorithm. They work without rights, under the fiction of being entrepreneurs. In Colombia, app-based delivery workers grind for 14 hours a day. If they're injured, they aren't compensated, they're deleted from the system, erased like disposable numbers. Marx would call this total precarization, the stage where capitalism doesn't just exploit workers but denies their very status as workers to evade responsibility. Meanwhile, the multinationals pocket record profits. Nestlé pays Brazilian dairy farmers pennies per liter of milk, but reported profits of $92 billion in 2022. Bayer buys Paraguayan cotton at prices that keep farmers perpetually in debt, while selling pharmaceuticals at 100 times their production cost. This isn't trade. This is organized extortion. Exactly what Marx warned of when he described the general law of capitalist accumulation: wealth concentrates at one pole, misery at the other. The real question Marx would ask today is, how long? How long until Honduran cane cutters, Peruvian textile workers, and Colombian delivery riders realize they hold more power together than all of Wall Street's shareholders combined? History shows us that every limit has its breaking point. And in Latin America, that point is closer than the elites imagine. Every time a Latin American country dares to challenge the capitalist order, the system responds, not with polite diplomatic notes, but with tanks, coups, and embargoes. Marx predicted that capitalism would never give up its privileges peacefully, and Latin American history confirms it in blood. From Guatemala to Chile, from Brazil to Honduras, every attempt at wealth redistribution has been met with institutionalized violence. Operation Condor wasn't just a Cold War accident, it was the terrorist face of capitalism in panic. Marx grasped a truth that remains as sharp today as it was in the 19th century: capitalism cannot tolerate true independence on the periphery. And nowhere is that more painfully obvious than in Latin America. The irony is almost unbearable. Wealthy nations demand that Latin American economies keep their doors wide open, while those same wealthy nations quietly protect their own industries with billions in subsidies. Take U.S. cotton, heavily subsidized, shielded by policy, while farmers in Brazil and Paraguay are crushed under the weight of unfair competition. Free trade? Hardly. This is not free exchange. It's economic imperialism, exactly the dynamic Marx warned us about. So we're left with the haunting question: how long can this pattern repeat? The region has already been plundered by colonialism, strangled by unequal trade agreements, and sabotaged by imperialist interventions. Yet, as Marx reminded us, oppression always plants the seeds of resistance. Picture this: a Brazilian farm worker bent under a scorching 40-degree sun, harvesting coffee for export. A Mexican laborer in a maquiladora, stitching garments for 12 hours straight. A Bolivian miner descending deep into the earth, 400 meters down, to claw tin and silver out of shafts that resemble tombs more than workplaces. Different nations, different industries, but the same tragic reality: they generate enormous wealth, yet never touch its fruits. Marx had a word for this: surplus value. The idea is devastatingly simple: the worker creates far more value than they ever receive in wages. The difference, the surplus, flows upward. Legalized robbery masked by the paycheck. And in Latin America, this robbery doesn't belong to the past. It reinvents itself every single day, often with even sharper cruelty than in Marx's time. In Victorian England, a textile worker might work 14-hour shifts. But in Guatemala or Honduras today, 16-hour days are common. And here's the cruel twist of history: in 19th century Europe, labor movements were slowly gaining strength to resist. In Latin America today, unions are dismantled by blacklists, crushed by state repression, or silenced with hired guns. Capitalism, Marx predicted, will always search for the cheapest labor. And Latin America became its perfect laboratory. Just look at the maquiladoras on the US-Mexico border. Women assemble high-tech televisions that will sell for $600, yet their daily wage is $6. The secret is relative surplus value. Technological progress increases productivity, but the gains never go to workers, only to bosses and shareholders. The story repeats in Central America's sugarcane fields, where cutters collapse from heatstroke before the age of 30. That is absolute surplus value, profit wrung directly from human exhaustion, from squeezing every last drop of life itself. Or consider the Bolivian miners of today. They breathe toxic dust, knowing it will kill them by 40. They earn $30 a day risking their lives, while European mining executives earn the same amount in 30 seconds. Marx once wrote, "Labor consumes not only material but the worker himself." Could there be a clearer picture of that truth? But modern capitalism has invented even more cynical forms of exploitation. Enter the gig economy. App-based delivery services have turned Latin American riders into what we might call the proletariat of the algorithm. They work 14-hour days, under the illusion of being independent entrepreneurs. When injured, they're not compensated, they're simply erased from the system, deleted like disposable data points. Marx would call this total precarization, the stage where the system doesn't even acknowledge workers as workers, just to escape any obligation to them. Meanwhile, the multinational giants report record-breaking profits. Nestlé pays Brazilian dairy farmers pennies per liter of milk, yet announced over $90 billion in profits in 2022. Bayer buys Paraguayan cotton at prices that sink farmers into endless debt, then sells pharmaceuticals at 100 times their production cost. This is not trade. This is extortion, organized and industrialized. Exactly what Marx described in the general law of capitalist accumulation, wealth concentrating at one pole, misery accumulating at the other. And so the burning question, how long? How long before Honduran cane cutters, Peruvian textile workers, and Colombian delivery riders recognize that, together, they hold more power than every Wall Street shareholder combined? History whispers its answer, every limit eventually breaks. And in Latin America, that breaking point is closer than the elites dare to imagine. Because every time a Latin American nation dares to challenge the capitalist order, the reaction is brutal. Not polite notes of diplomacy, but coups, embargoes, invasions, and tanks. Marx predicted capitalism would never surrender its privileges peacefully. And Latin America's history confirms this in rivers of blood. From Guatemala to Chile, from Brazil to Honduras, every attempt at redistributing wealth has been met with violence dressed in legal robes. Operation Condor wasn't an accident of the Cold War. It was the capitalist system in panic, its terrorist face revealed for all to see. Between the 1960s and 1980s, US-backed dictatorships swept across Latin America. Coordinated regimes kidnapped, tortured, and murdered over 60,000 leftist activists in just 6 countries. Why? Because these activists dared to talk about land reform. They wanted to nationalize resources. They sought to raise wages. For the capitalist order, those were unforgivable crimes. When Salvador Allende in Chile attempted to build a democratic road to socialism, the response was swift and brutal. On September 11, 1973, fighter jets bombed the presidential palace, La Moneda. What followed was 18 years of dictatorship under Pinochet, transforming Chile into the first laboratory of neoliberalism. Marx once wrote that the state is nothing more than the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. Nothing illustrates this better than the CIA's declassified files. These documents prove that corporations like the United Fruit Company, today rebranded as Chiquita, directly financed mercenaries to overthrow Guatemala's Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. His crime? Wanting to distribute idle land to peasants. Brazil tells a similar story. The 1964 coup that toppled João Goulart was not simply a military act. It was backed by multinationals like IBM and General Motors, who feared labor reforms that might cut into their profits. But modern imperialism learned to be more subtle. Instead of tanks on the streets, today we see parliamentary coups. In Brazil, Dilma Rousseff was removed from office in 2016 under the guise of legality. Lawfare became the new weapon, targeting figures like Lula in Brazil and Cristina Kirchner in Argentina with endless judicial persecution. Economic wars followed. Venezuela was hit with sanctions that cost the country over $230 billion. When Evo Morales nationalized Bolivia's gas in 2006, increasing royalties from 18% to 82%, Spanish companies like Repsol and British Gas didn't send soldiers. Instead, they pressured the European Union to impose sanctions and funded separatist movements within Bolivia. The old Monroe Doctrine revealed its true meaning, not America for the Americans, but Latin America for U.S. corporations. Trade agreements became the polished mask of domination. NAFTA, now USMCA, devastated Mexican agriculture. Since 1994, over 2 million farmers have been driven into ruin, unable to compete with heavily subsidized U.S. corn flooding the market. Marx had already warned us, free trade between the strong and the weak is nothing but the freedom of the wolf to devour the lamb. The World Bank and the IMF tightened the noose. Their loans always came with prepackaged recipes, privatization of public services, cuts to labor rights, markets forced open for foreign capital. Argentina under Mauricio Macri in 2018 is the textbook example. The government borrowed $56 billion, money that vanished in capital flight while ordinary people endured 50% annual inflation. And yet, history reveals an irony. Every coup, every intervention, every act of economic sabotage only confirmed Marx's analysis. When the U.S. invaded Grenada in 1983 or financed the Contras in Nicaragua, they weren't fighting communism. They were defending the profits of corporations like Coca-Cola and Exxon. This is the truth hidden from history textbooks. Anti-communism was never about freedom. It was the mask of capitalism in panic, terrified of social justice. And now, a new fracture is emerging. With China offering loans without political strings, and Russia selling vaccines without blockades, the old empire trembles. The monopoly on coercion is cracking. And as Marx predicted, every system built on oppression carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. But capitalism's crimes didn't stop at human exploitation. They also ravaged the very land that sustains life. Marx called this the metabolic rift, the brutal imbalance created when capitalism treats nature as an infinite reservoir to plunder. No place on earth demonstrates this more vividly than Latin America. Ancient forests reduced to pastures. Sacred rivers poisoned into industrial sewers. Entire mountains blown apart for a handful of minerals. The Amazon itself has become the most devastating portrait of capitalism's war against the planet. Between 2019 and 2022, an area larger than Belgium disappeared from the Amazon. 34,000 square kilometers of virgin forest turned into charcoal, soybeans to feed European cattle, and grazing land for fast food hamburgers. The lungs of the earth are being suffocated, not by nature itself, but by tractors financed by banks in New York and Frankfurt. Marx warned us long ago, capitalism turns all sacred relationships into commercial ones. Where indigenous peoples once saw a living Mother Earth, corporations see only raw material to be extracted, down to the very last drop. Mining tells the same story of destruction. In Brazil's Cerrado, companies like Vale and Anglo-American drain 2.5 billion liters of water every single day just to wash minerals, while entire communities are left without drinkable water. In Argentina, Chevron's fracking poisoned aquifers in Patagonia, producing oil destined for consumption in the global north. The result? Cancer in children, rivers turned to lifeless channels, and farmland rendered sterile. This is not development. This is necroeconomics, a system that profits from the slow death of ecosystems. The agribusiness sector reveals the perverse logic of capital even more clearly. In Mato Grosso, 98% of the soy is genetically modified, sprayed with 600 million liters of agrochemicals every year, many of which are banned in Europe. And here's the grotesque irony: the same banks that finance this destruction, BlackRock, JP Morgan, then sell green bonds to climate-conscious Europeans. Marx would call this the fetishism of commodities taken to its extreme, the ability of capitalism to turn even its own destruction into a product for marketing. The numbers are staggering. Latin America has lost 94% of its wildlife since 1970. Nearly 40% of violent conflicts in the region today are over land and water. And in 2022 alone, 200 environmental defenders were murdered. Think of Berta Cáceres in Honduras, assassinated in 2016 for opposing a hydroelectric project. Her killers weren't bandits, they were hired guns, working on behalf of a bank and the Honduran state. This is what capitalism calls progress, a bullet to the head of those who defend life itself. And yet, the cruelest irony is global hypocrisy. While the global north preaches sustainability, its corporations treat the global south as a sacrifice zone. Germany shuts down nuclear plants, only to buy coal from Colombia, where children dig in illegal mines. Norway boasts of its electric cars, but every Tesla battery contains lithium extracted under the blazing Atacama sun, where indigenous communities lose their aquifers to feed the so-called green economy. Marx foresaw this contradiction. Capitalism develops productive forces, but only by poisoning the very sources of all wealth, the earth and the worker. When we watch rivers in Brazil die, or glaciers in the Andes vanish, we are witnessing in real time the fulfillment of Marx's prophecy. The pressing question remains: what is the price of development that destroys its own foundations? Because when the last river is poisoned and the last tree cut down, financial reports will still announce record growth. But, as Marx reminds us, capitalism doesn't collapse when it destroys its workers. It collapses when it destroys the very world that makes its existence possible. Cultural genocide, the other frontline. But capitalism doesn't stop at land and bodies. It also wages war against identities. In Latin America, this war is not fought with tanks but with billboards, social media algorithms, and school curricula designed to make children ashamed of their roots. The statistics speak for themselves: an indigenous language disappears in Latin America every 2 weeks. In Mexico, 90% of children's programming is dubbed from the United States. In Sao Paulo, 70% of indigenous children in urban schools are bullied for speaking their mother tongue. What capitalism sees in millennia-old cultures is not richness, but obstacles to consumption. In Mexico, where maize was sacred to the Maya and Aztecs, Monsanto, now Bayer, patented genetically modified seeds while farmers were arrested for saving native ones. In Peru, Andean communities who revere Pachamama are bombarded with ads equating happiness with soda and smartphones. Marx would call this total alienation, when the worker is not only separated from the product of their labor but from their own history and culture. Tourism exposes the cynicism of this process most clearly. In Cancun, 5-star resorts sell authentic Mayan experiences, while actual Mayan descendants serve drinks at minimum wage. In Bolivia, German agencies sell spiritual retreats with rented shamans, while real Aymara spiritual leaders die without medical care. Capitalism doesn't just steal land. It steals sacred symbols, repackaging them as disposable commodities. Education, too, becomes a weapon of erasure. In Chile, Mapuche children are punished for speaking Mapudungun at school. In Brazil, textbooks reduce the complexity of pre-Columbian civilizations to a few paragraphs, while devoting entire chapters to the European Industrial Revolution. As Marx already said, the ideas of the ruling class are, in every epoch, the ruling ideas. When an indigenous youth believes progress means abandoning their language to work in a call center, capitalism has won its most complete victory. And yet, resistance persists, in the cracks, in the interstices, in the quiet survival of traditions capitalism tries to bury. In southern Mexico, community radio stations still broadcast in indigenous languages, despite state persecution. In Ecuador, young people take to TikTok, using viral dances to teach Quechua. In the favelas of Rio, funk music reinvents African traditions that were banned for centuries. These are not just cultural curiosities, they are flashes of what Marx once called proletarian culture, the ability of the oppressed to create art that resists domination. Here lies the irony. While capital tries to homogenize everything, the market has discovered that authenticity sells. Major fashion brands now pay fortunes, or outright steal, indigenous designs, transforming sacred patterns into luxury prints. This is the final stage of exploitation, when even resistance is commodified. But Marx also taught us, every system of domination carries within it the seeds of its own contradictions. When Zapatistas use the internet to spread their struggle, or Bolivian rappers fuse hip-hop with Andean melodies, they prove that culture is not only a terrain of domination but also a battlefield. In this silent war for the soul of entire peoples, capitalism may control algorithms, but the people hold 5 centuries of accumulated resistance. Debt, the new chains. Marx revealed one of capitalism's dirtiest secrets: debt is the chain of the 21st century. Where past conquerors used iron shackles, modern bankers enslave entire nations with signed contracts and compound interest. Latin America is not poor. It is systematically impoverished by a financial system designed to funnel wealth to Wall Street and the City of London. The mechanism is brutally simple. 1. International banks lend billions to Latin American governments. 2. When the debt becomes unpayable, they impose structural adjustments. 3. The result always looks the same: privatizations, cuts to labor rights, and forced openings to foreign capital. Argentina is the most infamous case. Between 1976 and 2001, its external debt ballooned from $8 billion to $160 billion. Where did the money go? Declassified documents reveal the loans were used not for development, but for buying weapons to repress its own people, padding offshore accounts of allied businessmen, and subsidizing multinational corporations. When Argentina finally collapsed in 2001, the IMF swooped in, demanding austerity as the price of rescue. Poverty skyrocketed from 38% to 58% of the population. Marx had already described this mechanism in Capital. Public debt becomes one of the most powerful levers of primitive accumulation. Brazil faced a similar fate. Between 2016 and 2018, under President Temer, Constitutional Amendment 95 froze public spending for 20 years, a direct demand of financial markets. The consequences? A 30% collapse in healthcare investment and 13 million more people plunged into extreme poverty. Meanwhile, Brazilian banks posted record-breaking profits. Mexico's experience tells the same story. Under NAFTA, the country was forced to abandon agricultural subsidies, driving 2 million farmers into bankruptcy. At the same time, the treaty protected corporate profits through the ISDS mechanism, giving companies the right to sue governments for any law that reduced their expected earnings. When Mexico introduced a soda tax to fight diabetes, Coca-Cola sued, and won. The weight of the chains. The numbers are staggering. In 2023, Latin America paid $190 billion just in debt servicing. That figure is 3 times larger than the region's combined budgets for health and education. This is capitalism's playbook in action. Yesterday, it was colonialism. Today, it is the tyranny of debt. The tools have changed, from muskets to mortgages, from shackles to spreadsheets, but the goal is the same: extract wealth, enforce dependency, and suffocate resistance. Nearly 40% of Brazil's exports don't go toward building schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. They go directly to paying interest on debt. The system is so perverse that even countries with massive trade surpluses, like Chile and Peru, see their mineral wealth siphoned off to pay dividends to foreign shareholders. Marx had a term for this: the export of capital. It's when wealthy nations transform entire regions into permanent income streams. And the irony is staggering. The United States can print trillions of dollars without facing collapse. In 2020, the Federal Reserve injected $3 trillion into the U.S. economy, and the world barely blinked. No catastrophic inflation, no collapse. But when Argentina tries to issue currency simply to pay wages, the punishment is immediate: hyperinflation, economic strangulation, and a hostile global market. This is not economics. This is imperial double standards. The hope of resistance. And yet, there is light at the end of this tunnel. In the last 2 decades, Latin America has seen waves of progressive governments experimenting with alternatives. The Bank of the South, envisioned as a counterweight to the IMF. Regional trade agreements conducted in local currencies, reducing dependence on the dollar. Bold debt restructurings, like Ecuador's in 2008, which slashed illegitimate obligations and freed resources for social programs. Marx predicted that finance capital would become the most parasitic and concentrated form of capitalism. Today, when Argentine families go hungry while hedge funds collect 16% interest, his words become painfully clear. Capital is not neutral, it is value feeding on value. And so the final question emerges: how much longer will Latin America accept being shackled by contracts signed by corrupt elites and military dictatorships? History tells us one thing: every unpayable debt eventually gets repudiated. When that day comes, the bankers will learn the meaning of Marx's famous phrase, the expropriation of the expropriators. The seeds of transformation. Despite all the violence, sabotage, and financial suffocation, Latin America is not merely a victim. It is also a cradle of alternatives. Across the region, new models of society are being built in real time, many carrying the DNA of Marxist ideas adapted for the 21st century. In Venezuela, popular communes administer over 40% of the national territory, showing that self-management is not a utopia but a reality. In Brazil, the Landless Workers Movement, MST, has created over 2,500 schools in rural settlements, raising a new generation of intellectual peasants. In Bolivia, the nationalization of gas in 2006 reduced extreme poverty from 38% to 15% in just a decade. And perhaps the most striking example, worker-controlled factories. After Argentina's 2001 crisis, more than 400 bankrupt companies were taken over by their workers and transformed into cooperatives. From the metal factory Zanon, renamed Fazenpat, factory without bosses, to the Bowen Hotel in Buenos Aires, workers proved they could produce without bosses, share profits equitably, and preserve jobs that capitalism had deemed unsustainable. Marx would have called this the workers' control of the means of production, not as a theory, but as a living experiment. A new Latin American Marxism. Indigenous peoples are also reinventing Marxism, weaving it with ancestral knowledge. In Mexico, the Zapatistas have built autonomy in 43 municipalities, with their own systems of health, justice, and education, all without a single cent from the state. In Ecuador, CONE, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities, combines the fight for land with eco-socialist practices, turning the principle of buen vivir, good living, into an anti-capitalist economic alternative. Meanwhile, regional integration is offering glimpses of life beyond the dollar. Step by step, experiments in trade and cooperation show that dependency is not destiny. The unfinished story. Marx never predicted a predetermined future. What he offered was a lens, a scientific way to understand exploitation and the concrete possibility of transformation once the exploited become conscious of their power. And in Latin America, that consciousness is alive. From communal lands to recovered factories, from grassroots schools to eco-socialist movements, a new chapter is being written. It is the story of peoples who refuse to remain slaves to debt, who dare to imagine that another world is not only possible, but already being built. The story of Latin America is not just one of suffering and exploitation, it is also one of resilience, innovation, and resistance. Take, for example, the Bank of the South and the regional compensation system known as Sucre. These mechanisms allowed countries like Bolivia and Venezuela to trade with one another without depending on the global financial system dominated by Washington and Wall Street. When the United States tried to isolate Venezuela by blocking transactions in dollars, the country responded by creating the petro-cryptocurrency. It was far from perfect, but it proved something crucial: monetary sovereignty is possible. The numbers of resistance. The statistics of Latin America's defiance are astonishing. Cuba has trained over 100,000 doctors who serve the poorest communities across Latin America. In Brazil, the Landless Workers Movement, MST, now produces 70% of the country's organic food. In Chile, state-owned enterprises that were first created under Salvador Allende still account for 15% of the nation's GDP. And culture has become a frontline in this struggle. In Brazil, marginalized rappers transform capitalist alienation into revolutionary rhymes. In Bolivia, indigenous film collectives are building a new visual language outside of Hollywood's dominance. Each of these movements represents what Marx once described as class consciousness made real, expressed in art, culture, and community. A heroic creation, not a copy. The challenges are enormous: media sabotage, parliamentary coups, and the brutal machinery of state repression. But as José Carlos Mariátegui, the great Peruvian Marxist thinker, once said, Latin American Marxism cannot be a copy. It must be a heroic creation. And that creation is happening right now. Delivery workers are forming digital unions to fight back against the algorithm. Indigenous women are leading battles against mining corporations that threaten their lands. Students from the favelas are occupying universities, claiming spaces once reserved for the elite. This is Marxism, not as dogma, but as method, analyzing material reality and transforming it. The faces of transformation. In today's Latin America, this transformation wears many faces. The factory worker in a maquila organizing her union. The indigenous teacher giving lessons in 2 languages. The mother of a disappeared political activist who becomes a member of Congress. Capitalism believes it has defeated Marxism. But it has made a fatal mistake: it forgot that ideas come back when reality confirms them. And in a Latin America marked by precarious work, unpayable debt, and relentless environmental destruction, Marxism is not a relic of the past. It is the most urgent tool to understand, and to change, the present. The future is being written. As the Zapatistas remind us, for us, the end of the world already happened in 1492. Everything since has been resistance and reconstruction. And in that reconstruction, Marx's ideas remain alive, not as scripture, but as a guiding light for those who dare to imagine a world where Latin America is not a victim, but the protagonist of its own history. If this video made you think, stick with us, because the story doesn't end here. The next chapter is already being written.